black thing go from left to right, and I thought, I'm going to die out here. No one's ever going to know. I couldn't believe what my eyeballs were showing me. I'll never forget how evil the eyes were. It was horrible. I mean, I've never seen nothing that evil.
It ran towards me at a rate that I can't even explain. Turned and stared at me, and this look of, I just want to kill you. I want to say it was human, but it wasn't.
He was yelling at me to grab a gun. I was like, for what? He said, just grab a gun. And there's footprints all the way to the door of my house. It had went inside my garage, all the way to the door.
911, what are you reporting?
Jesus Christ, you better...
Sir?
Zia!
Hello?
Get somebody out here.
What's going on now, sir?
That son of a bitch is about 6'9", I don't know.
Do you see him now, sir?
Yes, I'm looking right at him.
Uh-oh.
You're listening to Sasquatch Chronicles. Check us out online at sasquatchchronicles.com. If you've had an encounter, email me. My email address is wes@sasquatchchronicles.com. Welcome to the show, everyone. Thanks for being here tonight. Got a great show planned for you this evening. We'll be talking to Kevin, who is originally from Ireland, and Kevin has some strange experiences he wants to share with us tonight, and it makes you stop and think, when you think of leprechauns like that with the Irish, a little man in green running around, did something get lost in translation? Were they talking about a little man in green, or were they talking about a little green man, more on the alien side? So Kevin will go into that tonight, and then he's also had a few Sasquatch encounters we'll talk about. If you've had an encounter and you'd like to be on the show, shoot me an email. My email address is wes@sasquatchchronicles.com, and if you get a chance, check out sasquatchchronicles.com. You can become a member and get additional shows. Well, let's jump into it tonight. I want to welcome Kevin to the show. Kevin, thanks for coming on.
Thank you so much, Wes, for letting me come on and talk about this subject.
Yeah, I'm fascinated by it, and I know you've had a lot of different encounters growing up in Ireland. I kind of like to start there as a kid. Kind of walk us into, I know you guys had kind of a ritual you guys did. Tell me about that, and kind of walk into what you saw.
Yeah, I mean, Ireland is a funny place in a lot of ways, Wes, because of the fact that, you know, a lot of people, even that they go to church or whatever, they still do small ritualistic things for little people, fairies, however you want to define it. I guess we would normally define little people as what are called the she people. That's where you get the back end of banshee and things like that. And so they you know, people have been in a situation where in Europe you can still see that people put out offerings for gnomes in Norway or Iceland or whatever, or elves. And in Ireland, a lot of times that's true too. Now, my family had a background that was more into the sort of druid idea. And, you know, and Druidism never really was extinguished fully, I believe, in Ireland. I mean, Romans talked about, you know, killing all the Druids and stuff like that in England. But, of course, they never went to Ireland. They never went to Scotland. So a lot of these cultural ideas stick. And you can see that in Irish literature and everything like that up until the 20s, 20s and 30s. I think people still believed in what was called a fairy doctor, who basically was like a, you know, like a shaman. and they would use the energy of the fairies to heal people. So that being said, we used to go up to a big tree in the forest behind the village that I grew up in, and make an offering to fairies. Now, it maybe if it's not an offering per se, you can really call it a placation. In other words, fairies are not necessarily one of those things that you want to involve yourself with. I mean, we could talk about that later about what contracting with a fairy is like. But in this case, we would go up and we would do this. My aunt, my great aunt, and people from the whole family for years. Basically, my mom's side of the family had lived in this village for centuries. Had been doing this and had talked about seeing this leprechaun up there. So what we would do is we would take a acorn cup and fill it with honey, and we would leave it at the bottom of a tree. Not much like people gift Sasquatch or anything else. That's the same idea. You're basically just trying to have some interaction with it. And so one time we were up there, my mother and I, and this thing was 2 to 3 feet tall. I mean, at the time I didn't see that. Eventually I would say that, but let me put it in perspective. I know I kind of, I get so excited about talking about this, but so this head popped out of the bushes, and it was like a doll. I would describe it the way my aunt had written it down in the 50s as a doll head, like a porcelain doll head that was gray-green. And the way, in other words, it showed no emotion. I mean, you've got your standard sort of idea of this fixed face with big black eyes and slits for a nose and slits for a mouth. It didn't have ears either. I mean, it was flat on the on the side. It didn't have protruding earlobes or the construction of the cartilage around the ears like humans do. It basically then looked at me, came out of the woods, and at that point in time, out of the bushes, because originally I thought maybe I'm just seeing a cat or something like that, and it came out of the bushes, and it was a 2 to 3 foot tall naked creature that was it had no genitalia on it. It was androgynous in that sense, and had long, spindly arms, long and fingers. And I couldn't see the feet because it was always in the underbrush and things like that, but long legs. And it started to run around. Basically, it was so quick in the way that it was moving that basically, I saw it for probably 10 seconds at most. It might have been less than that, Wes, just simply because of the fact that, whenever you're seeing that kind of thing, that seems like time stops for a while.
Yeah.
But I have a definite image in my mind. Well, whenever we came down and we talked about it, people didn't think that was crazy. I mean, that was the weird reaction that what living in that small village was like. So I guess what was pleasing to me is that to country folk, that wasn't a bizarre necessarily thing. They thought I was telling the truth. My family had always told the truth, told these same stories for a long time. And so nobody even got really weird about it. It wasn't like that's not possible or whatever. There's always an idea of what it could be and what it isn't. I mean, and nobody brought up the idea that it was a gray alien. It was gray-green, and the thing that I found later on, just trying to put this into scientific terms, is, and I speak Gaelic, I speak a Native American language too, so I had come up with the idea that the leprechaun representation that we all see on St. Patrick's Day is really sort of a sort of mistranslation of a little man wearing green instead of what it really truly is, which is a little green man, and that's that's almost the way that it comes down. So that's what started me on this. Now, understand, Wes, that my dad is a doctor. He's been the CMO of different insurance companies and things like that. And he wasn't pleased. You know what I mean? He was not pleased about the whole scenario. And so he, being an American, said to me, you just don't ever want to talk about that. Don't ever admit it. If you ever want to be anything in life, don't say anything about it. Which is odd, because once I started to actually talk about this and it became public that I've had these experiences, he's totally fine with it. You know what I mean? It's always odd whenever the story gets out that it's never the implication that you think it is, because people really genuinely love a good story. And from that standpoint in time, people can say to me, well, were you delusional? Is there any other witnesses? And so in that case, my mom was the one that was there. But then I did have a very strange, bizarre experience that was totally out of sort of all reality.
Well, before you go into that, let me ask you about this thing. And I find it fascinating because I've actually heard a lot of encounters on and off the air. You and I were talking about that one. It was a husband and wife that came on, and the husband was recounting seeing this creature, and it was only 2 or 3 feet tall, and it ran into the bushes. You know the story better than I do. I need to go back and listen. But it took off in something. It was like the size of a big barrel you would see on a farm. It shot up in the air and took off. And I've had another one. It was actually on the East Coast. He hasn't come on yet, but he talked about seeing this little, almost exactly how you describe it, and it was looking at him from around the barn, and they sat and looked at each other, and then he said it took off, and it was so fast. Do you think, what is it you think you ran into? Do you think it was aliens just running around in that area? Do you think it was another entity? What's your opinion on what you saw?
Well, I honestly believe that if you take the romanticism out of the folklore and you actually look at the folklore for what it is with fairies or the fae or whatever you want to do or say, I believe it, just like Jacques Vallée said, that a lot of these encounters that we talk about prior to understanding that, that zeitgeist of Roswell and everything like that, that really we are seeing the same being. In other words, whether you can make the claim, I guess it's crazy to claim that aliens are fairies, but I don't think it's crazy to make the claim that fairies have been interpreted, aliens have been interpreted by fairies for a long, long time. And you can see that in old lore. I mean, Irish people for a long time, they, Celtic people, that you can find this archaeologically, that, they had these huge cauldrons, and, this cauldron was a source of wealth. And basically when people would come, they would have these huge cauldrons, and you could fit a person in it, And when you go through some of the ancient stories of Ireland, you find stories that say, these 2 little 2-foot green alien things or fairies were flying around in this copper cauldron or some kind of a metal cauldron. It comes down and it puts somebody in it and it takes them away, and then they lose time and everything like that. They come back. And so, is that, if you use the Giorgio Tsoukalos way of kind of explaining everything, is that not just an alien abduction in another form? I mean, this is one of those things where you as far as alien abductions, they talk about changelings, these different beings that come in and sort of they take you, you come back, you're not exactly the same person you used to be. So so I think realistically that it is some kind of an alien thing. Whether you want to call it a fairy or not, that's up to you. But almost saying that you had an alien encounter gives you more credibility than you saw a fairy. I mean, and I think that that's because of like Harry Houdini and the debunking of the little girls in the fairy garden in England. And basically they may or may not have admitted that was all a hoax. But
Well, yeah, and you're right, and it comes down to how people describe it at the time. I think when we think of fairies, especially here in the United States, we think of Disney. But there was a gentleman I had on one time who he was reading his grandfather's diary, and he was on a farm. What happened was he walks out and he sees these two owls standing about 3 feet tall, talking to each other and looking at him. He goes back to get a gun, and they're gone. Well, he describes the owls, and if you read his description, it sounds like an alien. Big, huge eyes, small mouth, the way the head's shaped. So I kind of understand why he said owls. At the time when I heard it, I was like, I wonder what he really saw. And then if you look at an owl and you look at a gray alien, you can kind of see some resemblances. So I understood why he said owl. I think you're right. Sometimes things get lost in translation. You had mentioned another encounter was, and I cut you off and I didn't mean to.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm glad you did, really, because, at that point in time, this next thing, which happened within a year of this happening, I'm still, even though I've got the more evidence and the eyewitnesses that this happened, I'm still more hesitant to say that it happened. I mean, it's one of those things that you've got to understand. Whenever I'm sitting around the family dinner table at Christmas or Thanksgiving and this subject comes up, I still to this day say, did that really happen? Did that really happen? Am I imagining this? Because if I'm going to talk about this on the radio or whatever, I need you to say to me that this is actually true, because I don't want to look like an idiot. And at the same time, that's it. I mean, my mom and my brother were with me. We were in this small little village. We were walking in between. My grandfather owned a small little shop in the village, and I lived sort of kitty corner behind it, almost a block away. And I was walking through this alley. Well, fairy lore says that there's a thing called a fairy wind, and a fairy wind is basically like a slow dust devil. I almost hate to say dust devil because of the fact that dust devils are powerful. Fairy winds kind of, if you ever go to a location and you just see kind of leaves floating around a courtyard or something like that. They're just lightly blowing around in a circle. That's what we would
kind of in one weird spot. Yeah.
Yeah, like a weird vortexy spot or whatever. And it's just basically, that's the way that wind anomaly goes right there. Well, that's what you call a fairy wind, but it's not something that would push you over or move you. It's not like a tornado or anything like that. And so this fairy wind came, and we were always told that if a fairy wind comes, you lay flat on the ground and you let it pass over you. And in other words, you don't stand up straight, because that's how they try to take you. Because, again, fairies take you. And so my mom and my brother were there, and we were walking down this thing, and this thing came, and they stood out of the way in the doorway of the pub that was behind our house. And, it was Ireland. But anyway, so the pub that was behind our house, this thing passes through me, and I shot straight up in the air. It was the middle of the daytime. I shot straight up in the air, and I went to this was a 2-story building, the thing that I was next to. I went higher than the 2-story building, and I was just hanging there. I wasn't moving from side to side or anything like that. I still remember it as feeling weightless and looking down at my mom, and my mom was freaking out because she thought, he's going to, if this thing lets go or whatever it is that's got him, lets go, he's going to fall 20 feet. He's going to die. And so she said to me, say no 3 times. Well, 3 is a very kind of an important thing whenever you're dealing with spirits or whatever from another realm, because that's your intent. I mean, you see that a lot of times in a lot of different things in the Bible, whatever. They'll repeat something 3 times.
Yeah.
And so I said no 3 times, and then the thing just basically lowered me down. Now, what was weird about that is that I had sort of gone straight up, started moving towards the forest where I'd seen this tree, and I crossed over a road. This guy in a car actually went underneath me, and then I came back down, and I just landed gently, like something had just gone, it wasn't even like if you're standing on a platform and it goes up and down like a genie lift, that, it even wasn't like that. It was just I was weightless, and then I moved, and then I went back down. Now, there was no other phenomena around as far as, I didn't see a ship, I didn't see this, I didn't see some beam of light that I was being taken like Travis Walton or anything like that. But it was just this weird sort of thing that happened. Well, at that point in time, that's kind of like what really threw me over the edge, Wes, as far as trying to figure this out, because I was like, okay, the one thing's one thing, but this is like something that totally defies the laws of physics, gravity, everything. And so I really started to do a lot of research into like old fairy things. Now, I was still focusing on fairies at that point in time, and I was still focusing on things like fairy circles, which a lot of people now, fairy circles were basically crop circles of yesteryear. I went to, and talked to several people about these different types of things, and it's well known, documented that these circles disappear. One person I talked to said, well, I think it has to do with magnetism and all, and all these different types of things, or the wind from the leeward side of a hill creating a vortex. I mean, these are different types of things that I've tried to explain. In other words, if somebody gave me an explanation that it wasn't a fairy or wasn't this, I'd be happy. That's the thing. I've always struggled for that answer, because I ended up going to college. I actually wanted to be a pilot for a long time, and I got accepted into after we moved here, I got accepted into the United States Marine Corps ROTC program at the University of Washington and everything like that. I was trying to logically explain all these different things, and I just never could. I never could come to some peace about what this was. And I think, like a lot of people who start to experience these things in a paranormal sense over their life, and I almost think that it's like tagged at birth type thing. It's like, here's this weird thing that happened to you as a kid, and now weird stuff's going to happen to you for the rest of your life.
Right.
And it's almost too much. It's like you almost don't want to say, oh, I've had this experience. I think I've seen a Bigfoot. Which I have. And
yeah, no, I understand.
So, and then at that point in time, it's like, okay, yeah, great. You've seen a ghost. You've seen a fairy. You've been abducted by aliens, and now you're seeing Bigfoot. I mean, it's almost like a cruel game that the universe plays with you. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no,
it's
I understand. And sometimes
Yeah.
I wonder sometimes if everything's kind of intertwined in a different way than we see at first. But I understand what you're saying. I mean, I've had people who've had very strange encounters when they're young, but it usually doesn't end there. Usually they have several other, things that had happened to them. And, you mentioned fairies, and Gary Wayne talked about that. I had him on the Nephilim shows. He talked about that in his Genesis 6 conspiracy book. And when you read those fairy accounts, it sounds like alien abductions is what it sounds like to me. Even the Bible. Who was it? Ezekiel, a wheel within a wheel. Well, what is he talking about, a wheel within a wheel? But if you think of an alien ship, it kind of sounds like an alien ship is what he saw.
I think you're so right, Wes, and that's why I try to go through these different types of things, because of the fact that I believe that in a lot of ways that a lot of this knowledge gets suppressed in a way, and slightly changed, so that therefore we don't really think about it in that case. Now, obviously at a certain point in time when people were writing folklore, especially around the early Christian, sort of not the early Christian era, which is like to the third century. I think at that point in time, all bets are off. You could say whatever you wanted to. I mean, and that's why, you've got the Gnostic Gospels, and you've got all these different things and everything like that. And so you've got, lots of different stories that I think have been lost. And that sort of metaphysical side to the Bible isn't there now that it should be, in my opinion. Like I said, I'm not a theologian.
Yeah. No, I understand what you mean.
But what I'm saying is that from that standpoint, at that issue, a lot of these different things don't come into play anymore. And I think that that this is an issue for some people. Is like, to some people, what I saw would be a demon. What I say, that's what they'd say. You saw a demon in the woods, and that's what it is, and it's clearly that, and it clearly had malintent and all these different types of things. But I didn't feel it that way. I mean, people are open to their interpretation, their spiritual beliefs. I understand that. But if anything, I thought that this thing was neutral towards me, and so that's the thing I've always gotten about it. I think fairies have their own agenda, in a way.
Yeah, and I was kind of curious with that first encounter in the woods. Did that thing ever vocalize? Or I'm kind of curious what your mom thought about it too. Kind of two questions there. Did it ever vocalize, and
No.
what did your mom think?
No, it never did. It never had. Now, my mom has had paranormal experiences her whole life, and same kind of thing. You come from that family of people who are seen as, seers, and it's a documented thing that they used to actually come to people in the village that I lived in and try to, they were taken as children and trained up as druids in, the 800s and things like that. And so, that family stock is going to firmly believe that. So, yeah, she was completely not sort of fazed by it, which is a strange thing. And neither was any of the people like my aunt, who, like I said, had kept a journal of seeing this in the 50s. And it was like I keep saying aunt. It was my great aunt. So just to be clear, that she wrote it down, and it was exactly the same thing. And like I said, the words that she used as far as porcelain doll head, oversized porcelain doll head, like you can imagine what she's saying. She's trying to explain something as sort of a emotionless face that that she described with big eyes and everything like that, and the same kind of spindly body and everything. And so a lot of times people say to me, well, you watched Close Encounters of the Third Kind. That's where you got this idea from. That's what you were, this is all, a projection of, popular zeitgeist of the time. And then, and I say, well, I believe that, that movie didn't come out till 77, 78. Same year that Star Wars did, I think. And that was before that. And my aunt's thing was definitely before that. So unless she, so the description met with that. I mean, I think that's one of those things where a lot of times people will say, well, look at all these different types of aliens everybody's seen over the years. Well, this is a consistent type of a thing. I think that they're not necessarily looking at it from the standpoint of looking at other research, folklore, stories, and etc., and actually trying to put that together as a long-standing thing that's been coming around. Take, for example, Wes, Ant-Man. if you look at the story of ant people living under the ground, which fairies are supposedly do, and supposedly UFOs do now in these days, and they live in underground bases and undersea bases and stuff like that. That the ant people coming from the ground, being 2 to 3 feet tall, with this sort of a plasticine, oversized head, and a body like the skin the way it is, and sort of androgynous like that. Does that not smack of looking like an ant person to me? I mean, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, no, I understand. And you
so,
know, I don't take too much, and I didn't mean cut you off, but I don't take too much credit when someone says, well, you got that from a movie. I mean, and one thing that you said I think is very interesting is a leprechaun. I never thought about that before. You and I talked yesterday, and after we hung up, I thought, oh, that is strange. What do you think of when you think of a leprechaun? A little green man,
Yeah.
And so maybe somewhere between Ireland and America, something got lost in translation, and it wasn't this cute little man dressed up in a nice little suit and a top hat that lives by the rainbow. Maybe they were talking about something else.
Well, yeah, I think you can make a very, very good case for that, because I know that it's interesting that a lot of Celtic myth shows up in Appalachia. And so this is the thing where it people don't realize that, St. Patrick's Day, to me, even as a child, was not a big deal in Ireland. It just wasn't a big deal. You see parades in Ireland now. That came from America. It didn't come from Ireland, And so it's a strange thing where people don't understand the circularity of just how things move. And so, yeah, there's great stories of, like devil's rings, which I think are fairy rings in the Appalachian Mountains. Those people were mainly from, Scots-Irish stock, and you throw some German in it. I mean, if you look at sort of the whole idea of where Native American culture and Celtic mysticism and sort of West African stuff all comes together, it's the Salem witch trials. That's one example of all that melding together, and Tituba being exposed to all these different things, and sort of fundamentalism. And what happens whenever you enter into the mixing pot, these stories, and there's that juxtaposition between the two, and then people start experiencing these, witch trials and things like that. So, it's always interesting to me that, and I think I talked to you about it last night, that the Mi'kmaq people of New Brunswick, it's that First Nations tribe in Canada. They have stories of fairies and Sasquatch. I mean, these are two things that go together, and so from that standpoint, I don't know whether that's how that all incorporates. But whenever you start to talk about the old stories, that seems to predate European settlement.
Yeah,
but,
you're right. I mean, and you find it. There's a mix of, especially in America, there's a mix of different cultures. I mean, even down in Louisiana, the Lougarou, or Loup-garou, or however they pronounce it. And it's this werewolf that is, and it's kind of a cultural thing that was brought over, but people were seeing it down there, and so they only related it to what they knew. It's like when you say fairies, people might be turned off by that. Well, let's replace fairies and say aliens. Now all of a sudden everyone's listening. We're talking about the same thing. It's just a different way of describing it, a different, they didn't have the term aliens back then, so they said fairies.
I think you're right. It's sometimes people contact me about Dogman, and which personally I've never seen, but but they would be interested in a historical context for that, and it's funny because St. Patrick reportedly went into a village whenever he was a child. Whenever he was starting to do his missionary work, and he'd come back, and the whole town turned into wolves. And this is written in a sort of a religious document, giving the history of St. Patrick. And so, I mean, so it is funny that again, these are stories that we don't necessarily do find the connections, and it's such a huge topic that you have to be specialized in the way that you do that. Most people can't read Latin, so you're never going to hear that story, or they don't understand that type. So you basically deal with people who have to be able to read sort of Middle English and then translate it and then retranslate it, and then you get into that whole thing about that. And so I think that there's documentation of these things for a long time, and we've just got the small little bit of it.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you. I definitely tend to agree with you. So you grew up in Ireland, you moved to the States, and tell me about your Sasquatch encounter. I'm fascinated by it. Did it happen here in Washington?
Yes, it did, and it was kind of a funny thing. I'll tell you a little bit of a background. I used to in the 90s. I used to do a lot of Jeep tours in the mountains in Colorado, up by a place called Marble, which is on the backside of Aspen and Snowmass Mountain. And but we would do that. And I was up in the woods there, and we were out there for 3 months at a time, and basically in off-grid camping for 3 months at a time. And I never saw anything weird. Yeah, but I remember that these people had come down from Schofield Pass to the small little ghost town that I would take people to, and they were frantic. And I said, I was like, well, what's going on? I was the first one who had a radio with me to call down if they needed help. And I said, no, well, they're not. They didn't need help, but they said something's been following us up in the woods for like the last 2 nights. And I said, well, what do you mean? And he basically had said that, he felt like this huge thing was stalking around him, and every time he would stick his head out of the thing, these two glowing red eyes were like looking at him, and he'd go back in the tent, and they basically like held up in the tent all night. And then the next day they would move along, and he would feel like it was following them and everything. And then he got to me, and I remember unfortunately, I regret this now, but I think it was a learning experience. I said that's, even though I had, seen, a fairy and all these different types of things, I did what most people do. Oh yeah, those aren't real. You're hallucinating. You didn't see that. You know what I mean? I think I was a lot more really terrible. I was terrible about it, to be honest with you. Anyway, they did make a report, and it turned out to be that the people who researched it found it to be genuine, and I've seen it actually reenacted in several films about Bigfoot. But I was the first guy who put the kibosh on it, was the poo-pooer. So if anybody ever tells me my stories aren't real, I get it. But anyway, so that being said, I was up in the mountains by Granite Falls, Washington, off the Mountain Loop Highway, which is kind of an interesting place. It's it's kind of the most northern national forest, and nobody ever goes out there. I mean, it's like everybody's hanging around Mount Rainier, and you can go up on the Mountain Loop Highway. There's never anybody there at all. And so we had found this spot that you can go shooting in. That was actually not the federal land, but it was the county land, and the rangers told us we could go shoot there and everything like that. Well, we were up there, and I've always been sensitive to know, and I think most people do, when you're being watched. You get that really weird, creepy thing. We were up there, and this I would think that the elevation there is probably about 1,700 feet. So, and there's no kind of streams that come down from the mountain anywhere close to there. But I got this smell. The smell kept coming on the breeze, and it was just a horrible smell. I mean, that sort of dead salmon, rotting, feces type, stale urine type smell. And it just kept going around, and it just sort of freaked me out. And I thought, man, is there something dead around here? I just basically thought must have been a dead carcass around. And so I started to kind of walk around, and there was, I didn't find anything there. There was no sense of this smell. And the smell would just stop, and then it would start again. And it was just weird like that. And so I wet my finger. I licked my finger, held it up in the air. It's like there's no discernible breeze coming from everything. So it's just weird that this smell is coming like that. Then I really had my wife, was with me, she's a sensitive lady, and believes in spiritual Bigfoot. Let's put it that way. Well, she didn't at the time. I mean, we never had any experiences with Bigfoot, but she gets this thing in her head, like, what are you guys doing here? It was kind of like a voice like that, a feeling in her head. And I got the same kind of a weird strange thing too. Like, like something was kind of like watching us, and it was kind of pissed. And, whenever I was a kid, and my family had always said to me, if you enter into a strange room and you have this weird feeling, you tell them what you're doing and that you're just trying to do your business, and you'll be out of there and you'll leave. So I've always done that whenever I've walked into a room that somebody said is haunted. I've always said, my name's Kevin, I'm here just to take this, and I'm going to come back, and, whatever, I'm not any threat to you. So I actually started verbalizing that to the woods. So I really started to feel that this was there, and I said, yeah, we're here, we're doing this, and we're going to pick everything up, and we're going to leave. And it was because of the fact that she had felt that at the same time I verbalized it, that otherwise she would have never said that this happened. Well, then we started looking at it from the standpoint of, well, if this actually did happen to the both of us, and it's not some coincidence, and I'm not just saying it, maybe we should go back up there. That's when the obsession hit, Wes. Like now I've got to see this. And so we went up there repeatedly for a long time. And one time when we were up there, we would go to this same place every time. And it's kind of it's the way to describe it is strange. I mean, I don't know if the forest where you're at down there have this, but up here there's the elevation changes pretty quickly, and so you have what I call anyway, finger draws that so basically you have almost like an island with like these pits that go around, like these draws that go down around it, and sometimes they can be pretty deep, like 4 or 5 feet deep, and we were standing there, and I realized again that there was all these noises coming from these like draws, like something was sneaking around, that observing us from these sort of natural cover, like anything would, if realistically it was an intelligent thing, and it's curious, wants to observe you, like, why are these people up here all the time? What's the deal? And yeah, something started to move down this draw. Then I was standing to the right of my wife. My wife was looking to the left, and this thing passed her, like I would imagine. I mean, she estimated it at like 20 to 30 miles an hour. I mean, it was just cruising past her. And I looked over to the right, and two things passed me on the right, and they were, I saw the whole thing. It was 2 7 feet tall, beings that were covered in hair, were just running past me. I was really afraid, because of that. I have PTSD from being around military situations. And I said, they're trying to get behind us, which really worried me. Like, I don't understand why they're trying to get behind. Like, that was the thing that was my fear, was that these things were trying to get behind us. But, and so, yeah, that was it was amazing in the fact that my wife raised her camera up and took a picture. And so, I've had people look at it and they say, well, it's the classic weird, thing moving and people say, well, it's a shadow, or some say it's just not a shadow or whatever. But it's a blob squatch. I mean, you know what I mean? It's not evidence of anything. It's evidence to me that I wasn't sort of making it up at the time. But it's a weird thing. So then I started to get into all kinds of weird stuff. And then at that point in time, I really started to go to all these different conferences and everything like that, and got, have done research with different researchers. And, again, it's some of them controversial, some of them not. But I always said, I'll tell the truth about what happened while I was up there. Well, sometimes you just don't know that it's going to get that weird. But
yeah, no, I understand. And it is fascinating. And I'm sometimes with blurry pictures or like blob squatches, sometimes it's good to have a context behind it too. Like, what were you guys doing when you took this? And so, especially if you're capturing something in motion, it's going to be blurry.
Right.
How far away from you? What was this thing when the two things ran past you and the one past your wife?
The ones on my side were fairly far away. I think I measured it out to be about 50 meters, or roughly about 150 feet. On my wife's side, I would say it was more like 40 feet, maybe 30 feet. And so it was very close. Now, what I will say this, and I'm saying this I get a little excited about these things. And I get a lot of context. Okay. I have a master's degree in Native American education, and I used to teach on reservations on Native folklore and Irish folklore, and bringing those two things together. And a lot of the things that we find out on Native stories is that, especially, it's kind of a shame that a lot of people that unfortunately, what I'd say is a lot of natives don't know the history. It's unfortunate of their own tribe, and so, and this is something that I try to help with, dealing with elders and things like that, to sort of rekindle the idea of the folklore and everything like that, to bring it back. So I was immersed in sort of Sasquatch lore from a native perspective. I was lucky enough than that, because I don't think a lot of people actually do understand that, get that level of understanding from elders and things like that. But I will also say this, that elders, it's like a lot of things. You have to define what the value of truth is in a certain way. We used to teach things in what was called the 7 teachings of the grandfather, and one is truth, and the other was honesty. And I asked an elder to explain that to me one time, and I said, "Wait, can you explain that to me?" Because to most people, they're going to say that's it's a synonym of the other thing. It's like, if you're being truthful, you're being honest. If you're being honest, you're being truthful.
Right. Yeah.
Well, and so he said, well, it's like this. We all have our own truth. And so therefore, you can, as long as you're being honest about what you experienced, that truth goes through. In other words, they're not against the idea of multiple truths. In other words, if I went to a reservation and I talked to an elder and I said, "What's Sasquatch?" and he said, "Oh, it's this man that lives up in the woods and he's this, there's nothing weird about it, but he's just this thing that lives up there. We don't deal with them, and that's fine. That's his interpretation of it. If he's had experience with it, that's great. That's the way he says it. But you can also go to another elder in the same tribe, and he can say, "No, they're spiritual beings. They disappear. They go into some other realm." This is one of those things that is, unfortunately, and I don't think it gets really played into a lot into our understanding of native lore in a way that there's multiple truths, and somebody can bull up on you and say, now it's a man, it's this, it's an ape or whatever. But, in all fairness, they're not necessarily giving you the interpretation of it. Now, that being said, too, there's a lot of problem with giving locations of Sasquatch and things away, holy spaces and all these things away to people who would sort of take advantage of it. And so that's a tough thing. But I was told this location after where we saw this by somebody in the native tribe, and so and it panned out, but it's one of those things where but it is a strange thing. So people ask me about it, and I say, well, I say, if you're going to try to find a Sasquatch area, try to find some holy land or previously holy land around here that people revered, and in your neck of the woods you've got two, which is Mount Hood and Mount Adams. I mean, those are two distinct areas where I think that around the foothills of those two things you get multiple reports and all these different types of things. And it's weird because if you go to Mount Adams and you go on the Yakima side of the reservation, which is the eastern part of Mount Adams, and you can actually have a conversation with somebody, they'll say, "Oh yeah, we know they're real. We know they're there." There's not even a doubt.
And I find it fascinating you bring up the holy places, because you and I were talking yesterday, and he said it's interesting because a lot of these places are called, Devil's Canyon, Devil's Creek. And at first I was like, I don't know about that. But as we were talking, you were saying, what's the best way to keep people out of areas? You don't call it the holy area. You call it Devil's Creek or Devil's Hill or Devil's Mountain. Yeah. And people tend to stay away from places with Devil's name. Not so much now, but I think back in the day, if a place was called Devil's Creek, most people would stay away from it.
Yeah, I think you're very right, Wes, in the way that I think that at some point in time, as native peoples were being moved off their sort of land. I mean, obviously, you can look at it from the history of Washington and Oregon is kind of strange in the fact that I think for a long time, people were living side by side in the valley. That was okay. From that standpoint, and then it was really more of a sort of this is where you got to live. And so it's a tough call because I think that at a certain point, people say things to keep people out of the woods at a certain location. That's true in almost any culture. I mean, if you go to Appalachia, sometimes you're going to hear about the haunted woods. You're going to hear about that in Ireland. You're going to hear about that, and all these different things. And why is that? Well, it could be either that's a holy spot, they don't want you to go to it, or it could be there, I suppose back in the day, it was like, I got my still up there. I don't want you up there looking at it, or whatever. I mean, a lot of these myths about places being scary have to do with specifically keeping people out of certain sections of woods. Normally how it is it's not like, you stay out of all the woods. It's just like, no, you don't want to go into that holler, or you don't want to go into that, set of woods there. That one's not, that's not it. And I think, it's a human nature type of thing, is if you have no real barrier for people to get to an area, a lot of times people come up with scary stories to do it, or if you're a native person and a spiritual being or a spiritual character gets caught or whatever, what's the ramifications for them? I mean, if does it then sort of put a curse on people? I've actually heard that, you don't want to have anything to do with catching a Sasquatch or killing it specifically, because that would basically curse you and your family for forever. Now, people would say, well, is it really a curse? In the sense of, do curses really exist? Well, maybe it's not, but maybe it's sort of an allegorical thing. Could you imagine being, the guy who actually proves Bigfoot exists? From that standpoint, you draw it out of the woods with you. I mean, in a way, you might have fame, you might have fortune, but your life, I can guarantee you're going to have somebody with a microscope look at every aspect of your butt from the day you were born till now. Every time that you've ever been drunk, every time that you've ever, maybe hit somebody, and they're going to try, right. And somebody's going to try to, impugn you. And so again, that's almost the situation that it's in. I mean,
you become, I always say, the person who solves it, or if they kill one and bring it in, will be infamous. You'll be famous. You'll get money. You'll get paid. Trust me. But you might be infamous too. And it is kind of a curse. I mean, I have shows where witnesses come on and talk about killing them, and you see, or in positions where they've shot them, and you see the reaction from the public. They're so outraged by, someone saying what happened to them. There's this weird outrage with, especially the Bigfoot community, man, which is, I don't know, man, a little shaky at times. I think mentally, not so much eyewitnesses, but I mean, some of the people in the Bigfoot world, they kind of worry me. You know what I mean?
No, I think you're definitely. I think you're right. I think the biggest impedance to Bigfoot is the constant arguments that we have about it, and trying to define what it is and what it isn't. I mean, here's the thing. And I'll also say later on, whenever I was back in Colorado about 2 or 3 years ago, one walked across the road in front of me at the same place that these people had seen it. So just to bring that to full circle. So that's, if anybody wants to know where that is, that location is up by a ghost town called Crystal, in between Marble. It's Marble, go up to Crystal. There's a place called Lizard Lake there, which is a weird, bizarre place. And halfway between there's a meadow, and that's where I saw it, if you want to know exactly where it was. I have no problem telling anybody that's where I seen these things.
Tell us about that. What did you see?
Yeah, so it was just a bizarre thing. This was totally biological in nature. In other words, there was nothing to lead me to believe that this wasn't sort of like just a and I would describe it as a human, almost like not simian as much as a hairy man. I guess that's how I would define it. This thing was about 7.5 feet tall, was very super lean, not broad like it was broader than a standard person. But the hair didn't look like animal hair at all, I mean, almost, like the difference between like sort of ape hair and orangutan hair. It was more like orangutan hair, that sort of wispy hair. And so what happened was I was driving up in this side-by-side up to the thing, and I came across, I heard this rustling in the bushes, and Colorado's kind of a funny place, just like Washington State. I mean, like literally, something the size of a human could be 3 feet away from you in the woods, and you won't know because of the brush. That's the way that it is, and that's basically how it was around this trail. So this thing comes beating out of the brush, basically takes like 2 steps across this road, and it kind of looked at me, and it had to have known I was there, which is the thing that freaks me out in a way, because if you're on a gravel road in the middle of the mountains, those things, I mean, I can hear people coming from a mile away. I mean, and so this is not stupid, it did it on purpose, and so it crossed over the road looked at me. I mean, whether I imagine this or not, but this is really almost, it was like I read the body language, like it sort of shrugged its shoulders and said, what are you going to do about it? You know, it was kind of like, you know, and then it just looked straight ahead and kind of kept walking into the woods on the other side. And I was so dumbfounded by it. I just didn't, I mean, it's like people say, well, how come you don't whip out a camera and start chasing around it? It's like I'm trying to process this, you know, even though I believe I've seen it in the past. This is like broad daylight, you know. This is not under canopy of woods. This is not a shadow. This is thing like coming out of the brush, walking across a road, and going into the other side, and it's like, man, this is crazy. It's just absolutely crazy. And it's funny because you want to talk to people who research up there, and I know people who research up there because I hear them. You know, sometimes I'll be out in the woods, and you know, you'll hear these people coming and researching for things like, oh yeah, it's supposed to be over here, and take a picture of that, and take a picture of that, and it's like you just want to go up to them and say, are you looking for Bigfoot? Because this is where I would look, but you can't do it, and they're so shadowy about how they're doing it. So that's the thing that's funny. I believe that in certain research areas, there's probably 3 or 4 people, you know, researching it, and they never put their data together. And so that's a strange thing, you know.
Yeah, it is. And were you driving at the time, Kevin? I didn't.
Yeah,
I
was driving an ATV. I was
driving
an
side by side.
I was driving an ATV. It was side by side, and you know, it was
Can you describe what you saw? I'm just curious, for my own curiosity, what you actually saw.
It looked like if I were to put it, I'd say 7 foot tall, man-like thing. You know, like I said, I didn't see an ear, but I was under it because that was under hair. But the face was more like a bearded face, again with this wispier orange, sort of auburn hair, I guess you'd describe it. Not jet black and not brown like a brown bear, but sort of a more of a reddish tint to it. And looked like a 7.5 foot tall basketball player. Like literally, you know, if you were to take an NBA player, put him in a suit up there, I would say that was the closest thing that you could approximate it, except maybe it was broader than that. But like I said, so a lot of times people say to me, well, what do you think that was? And I say, well, I don't know what a Denisovan looks like. I don't know what if any of us knows what a Denisovan looks like. But if anything, I would think it would seem like to me that's a cross between a human and a Denisovan and a Neanderthal, because that would give it the height, weight, you know, the width and weight of a Sasquatch.
Was the face more human?
Yeah, it was definitely more human, and it was expressionful. It did have a maybe more of a splayed nose, like a full nostril type scenario. But in other words, it didn't seem to have, you know, sometimes you've got what's called a low bridge. Some people have what's called a low bridge. Some people have a high bridge. So like whenever you're buying cameras, a lot of people who are from Asian descent, they have they have to get a certain kind of glasses that sit on their face, a different way, because it seems like the nose comes out differently than maybe some of us European descendant people. And so I would say, yeah, and I that's what I would say. It was like an Asian bridge up to the nose. It wasn't like a predominant, you know, sort of what I was brought up to know as a Roman nose. But I think, you know, from that standpoint, and it was. I'm trying to think about exactly. I have it written down here somewhere, Wes. I'm sorry I didn't give you the.
No apologies. No apologies. Yeah, but it's fascinating though that.
Yeah.
You know what I find interesting, Kevin, about Sasquatch reports is a lot of times people will say it was very much human-like. And other times they'll say, no, it was very much more like a chimpanzee or, and I'm fascinated by the different descriptions. And I've had a lot from Colorado, where they said it was more human-like. And I've also had other types where people said it reminded them of an ape, looked just like an ape, except for the nose was a little different. And it had a bigger mouth, and the head was a little different, but it reminded them of an ape. It's just fascinating when you hear different reports. I honestly think, this is my own opinion, which doesn't mean much, but I think the ones that are more human-like generally tend to be less aggressive. When people say, oh, it looked like a Neanderthal, it looked like a Native American, except for being all hairy, generally they're less aggressive. I don't know if you found that through looking into it or not.
Well, yeah, it is interesting because as you come down and you talk to different people from different tribes from Alaska down, and luckily enough, I've been able to do that through different sources. That the more northern you get, it seems like you almost get it described to you as a wild. That's really the term that they would use, wild man of the woods. And it's almost like, the way that they describe it is like it's separate people who they don't interact with. It's like, this is where you're going to go. This is where I'm going to go. And so it's very human-like. They would almost describe it. They would describe it as people, but I think that these would have sort of a culture around them. In other words, that almost like Stone Age man in a way, that these people were doing that, and I asked somebody one time about it, and he kind of intimated that maybe that these things were a threat biologically. Not necessarily, and what I mean by that is as a carrier of a potential disease. And that would make sense to me in the way that some people describe trading or gifting with certain things. I know that for a certain reason, you wouldn't want to trade with somebody who was a carrier of somebody that would infect your whole tribe, because of the fact that, coming in contact with them is not necessarily the way you'd want to do it. But if you were to trade, as some Indians did with other Indian tribes or Native American tribes, that you would leave it in a trailway and wait. Somebody would replace it with something, and then they would take it. This is not uncommon. This is not uncommon for people to do, even with other tribes, that when you were coming into contact with people and realizing that disease in what you would call, quote unquote, a virgin population is a huge problem, as well as, because we know that, the constitution of many Native Americans weren't prepared for European diseases and things like that. And I'm not saying they're from Europe, but I'm just saying that they're definitely not that. Now, that would also make sense because of the fact that whenever you look at these stories of women mating with Sasquatch, that if they were people, that could work. In other words, it's kind of a creepy story, but it's true. Back in the 20s or 30s, Stalin was like trying to mate humans with apes. To try to do it, never could actually pull it off. But we know that through DNA that Denisovans and humans are compatible. We know that Neanderthals and humans were compatible. So it would make sense to me that if it was a humanoid that was very, very close to that could mate with us. Now, which would also be kind of a reason why we haven't. Everybody says, well, why don't you have any evidence or whatever? And somebody will say, well, I sent it in, it came back human. Well, would that not come back human? I mean, the Neanderthals and us shared 99.5% the same DNA. And so, and Denisovans probably the same way. So your initial sending is, I'm sending this hair in to get it analyzed, and it comes back human. Well, yeah, that's a good thing. You know what I mean? It's not going to come back an ape. because you know, unless you start to pay the big dollars, the initial screening of it is going to come back human. And so,
Yeah, what do they always say? Human contamination.
Yeah,
which always kind of makes me raise an eyebrow. It's like, really, all of this is human contamination.
Well, and this is it, you know, and then you, I mean, it creates enough doubt in people's minds to realize that, you know, I mean, I think that probably a piece of DNA has been submitted to somebody that's actually a Sasquatch DNA, and it came back human contamination, or it came back human with the initial screening of it. And it's already sitting there. I mean, it's like we probably already have probably have the proof somewhere. But then,
yeah, I would agree with you. So is that what you think Sasquatch is? Do you think it's more along the lines of an ancient hominid?
I would think so. And I mean, part of me really wants to say, you know, that's it. But again, Wes, I can't deny people's experiences in the fact that if I said that's what it was, and that's it, that's all there is out in the woods, that wouldn't be fair to people to say, oh yeah, well, you know, whenever you thought it disappeared, that didn't happen. You know, whenever you took that video of that trackway that just disappears in the middle of nowhere, that didn't happen. You know, I mean, what you're saying. Yeah. And so from that standpoint, I mean, again, it's a I would say that part of us are looking for, depending on where you are in the United States, there's probably 3 at least big creatures that are walking around in the woods, and I don't know, like if, for example, the Falk monster, you know, and you know, has 3 toes. Well, you know, show me some geneticist that can say that human beings, for example, can mutate into a 3-toed being. I mean, it's just not going to happen. I mean, they're not going to, I mean, it's not like you can say that. So for me, even if you, I mean, show me in history whenever somebody has mutated over time that many toes. I mean, in other words, yeah, Anne Boleyn was born with 6 fingers, but but Queen Elizabeth wasn't. You know what I mean? It's you know, that mutation, that strange sort of some people are you know, these vestigial problems or you know, like prehensile tails. Some people are still like that. Some people still are born with tails, you know?
Yeah, I get what you're saying, and I appreciate what you're saying, because you're right. I mean, and that's the problem is if you say, you know, like sometimes Bigfoot researchers say, well, it's Gigantopithecus. Well, I got about 20 questions for you that you can't answer. And you're right. There is a lot of weird. It's one of those topics. It's so hard to nail down. And what's the you know? And what's the deal with people saying it looked more human, and then other times they say it looked more ape-like or more chimp-like? It really is a mystery. It really is a mystery. Even people have seen it. It's a mystery.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I just want to say the mystery is probably what keeps me excited about it. You know, it's the fact that I really you know what keeps me going out into the woods is the fact that I want to experience this, not that I want to prove it. You know, to a lot of people it's not that way. You know, I mean, some people will say I'll never go into the woods again. You know, it's like I'll never go back into the woods. This has terrified me to the course of the way it is. And I totally respect that. But to me, it didn't seem like that. I mean, I'm more afraid. To be honest with you, I'm more afraid of a mountain lion than I am a Bigfoot, because again, I've said this before. I mean, anything that can climb up a tree and jump on you from above, you know, is terrifying to me. You know, like I you know, like I've seen a Sasquatch, but if I saw this quote unquote bat squatch that people talk about, I mean, I would be traumatized. I would be, you know, in a small, like, I can't imagine a huge thing being able to fly around and like come from above. I mean, that just literally would. I think I would be institutionalized at that point in time. I wouldn't be able to deal with it.
Yeah, the thing with the mountain lion is at least you'll never see it coming. You know, by the time it gets a hold of you. But Kevin, I appreciate you coming on. I got to have you back. I really enjoyed talking with you, and thank you so much for sharing some of the encounters you had in Ireland. I really enjoyed hearing them, man.
Yeah, and I'm so thankful, Wes, that I got to talk to you about it, and hopefully it comes down to the thing, like, if this helps one person say, I'm not weird and I saw this thing and what could it be? I mean, I guess we never did get to the answer about what it is, but I can tell you that ever since I've told my story, I've been contacted by people in Ireland, I've been contacted by people in America, and they're seeing it. So don't be afraid to say what you're saying, and go through it, because people believe it's happening. I believe it happened to me. I thank you, Wes, for giving me the opportunity to say that.
Yeah, well, thank you for the kind words, and I appreciate you coming on, Kevin. Have yourself a great night.
You too.
And that's it for tonight, everyone. Remember, if you've had an encounter, shoot me an email. My email address is wes@sasquatchchronicles.com. If you get a chance, check out sasquatchchronicles.com. You can become a member and get additional shows. Until next time, everyone.
About limitless infinite life. She is my thunder. No wonder I'm going under the intoxicating danger I like. Save me from myself, let me drown in my black lake. Let me float away. Save me from myself, let me drown in my black lake. Beauty is a black lake, let me sail away. Beauty is a black lake, let me sail away. Darkness approaching, deep water keeps flowing. It inhales me in the stormy tide. Endless emotion, a dawn thought, a notion, an epiphany, bring the shore to life. Save me from myself,